Well, good evening. And I say it that way simply because this is Friday night Bible study. So if you view this at the time we expect you to, it would be evening. Of course, it might be any other time, but that's okay. Because we're actually, nowadays, we are pre recording this because of problems we have had with trying to stream in Friday evening and having our internet connection go squirrely, and all of a sudden we're getting cut off in our streaming, and it makes it awkward for us and for the viewers both. So if we pre-record it, then it can upload as it likes, and you can watch it. And if there's any problems, it'll be due to your connection, not to ours.
You know what?
What?
Texans have a word to cover this question about what time of day it is.
Al, what's that word?
Howdy.
Audi, huh? Howdy.
Howdy.
Yeah. Well, I was born in Texas, so I guess I can sort of claim to be a Texan.
I grew up there.
Yeah, you spent a lot more time in Texas than I did. I was born there. We moved away when I was about a year old, and then I took a job in Texas and kept it for less than a week. So, other than visiting, it's been about the extent of my time in Texas.
I moved there when I was 3 and left when I was 16.
So that's 13 years.
Yeah.
Plus, you've been there to visit, I think, more than I have because you had family down there.
Yeah. Still do.
Yeah. Well,
Still have family there. Not able to visit.
it has been an interesting week. I ran across a new form of computer entertainment. It is our state's Department of Transportation motorist website where they post information on travel conditions and so forth. And they include links to all the state owned traffic cameras. And so you can go to their website and you can call up a particular traffic camera and you can see what's going on. They also put up reports of incidents, and in our state, that's pretty up to date. They'll have an accident happen on the interstate or on another highway, and they'll have a notification of it up on this website within 5 or 10 minutes. So you can go look. So Monday, I happened to notice something out on the west side of our state, and so I looked to see if there was a traffic camera nearby. There was. I went to it, and they had it zoomed to the site of the incident. Turns out what happened on the west side of the state, there's most three-digit interstates are shorter. They like go around a city or through a city or something like that. And so this truck was on a three-digit interstate coming up to the end of it, and it ended at a two-digit interstate that pretty much crosses the entire country. So he was taking the ramp from northbound short interstate to eastbound long interstate, and he took the turn too fast for how tightly he had to turn to make the curve. And he ended up tipping his truck over. The tractor went all the way over on its side. He was hauling a flatbed, and the flatbed went almost clear over, totally upside down. The load he was hauling was lumber. So as soon as he did this, the entire all lanes of that long interstate got blocked by all this lumber in the roadway. When when I saw it and looked at the camera, they had brought out um, what's that little tractor they make? A Bobcat. They'd brought out a Bobcat tractor, and they had pushed all the lumber off into the median. And so they closed off one lane of the interstate. They had a new flatbed truck parked there, and this Bobcat tractor had forklift extensions on it. And so they had a crew there hand stacking this lumber, and then this Bobcat would take the stack and put it on this flatbed to get the lumber off the median and to recover whatever was recoverable. I'm sure that some of the lumber actually broke in the incident or in getting the lumber off the highway. And you could see where they were stacking broken pieces of lumber off to the side. This thing happened, I think, before 9 o'clock, and it was like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon before they got it fully cleaned up.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
If a woodchuck did chuck wood, how much wood did that woodchuck chuck if that woodchuck did chuck wood?
How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood, right?
That's not what I said.
I know it isn't what you said, but that's the saying you're referencing, which is a tongue twister.
I actually said it too.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I've kind of been doing that off and on this week. It was this condition where another interstate in our state, another two-digit interstate, there's a section where it's reduced to 2 lanes because they're paving the other 2 lanes. So the traffic is routed across so that northbound traffic is going up the south, the right hand, well, what would be the left hand southbound lane, but if you're going the other direction, then it's a right hand lane. So, and it was in that northbound lane where there's not much of a shoulder that an 18-wheeler broke down, wouldn't go anymore. And traffic couldn't get around it. There's no place to go. So the traffic just started backing up. And the camera was kind of a far bit away, so it was hard to see what was going on because it was at the extent of its ability to zoom. And they were actually doing digital zoom, so it was all pixelated and stuff. But they had to bring in one of those great big huge tow trucks. And because of the nature of the freeway, the tow truck had to back all the way from the northern exit down to where this truck was, because they couldn't drive forward and then turn around. They couldn't have done that. And there's a concrete barrier between lanes, so they couldn't come down the one lane and then turn around and come back. So he backed all the way down. It was like, and then once he got there, it was a half hour at least probably to get the truck hooked up and get the drive shaft pulled and all the stuff that they have to do to tow a truck before they actually got traffic moving on that interstate again. And then yesterday morning, I happened on one, and it was very close to a camera. And when I called it up, there was a Greyhound bus sitting there at the side of the road. And you could see passengers standing on the side. There was a fire truck there. So, you know, and it looked like they had the windows of the bus open. And it looked like maybe there was an ambulance stretcher bed sitting in front of the bus, but I couldn't be sure. It was hard to tell. I watched that for some time. Eventually, they brought a tow truck up there, and he hooked to the left front tire of the bus and hooked that to the winch on the truck and pulled that bus, sideways from the front over just enough to make it possible to open the passenger side door. And that's when I realized the bus hadn't just stopped up against the side of the highway. It was actually up against a guardrail at that part of the interstate. and was leaning right up against it. So passengers couldn't get out through the door because the door wouldn't open. And that's why the windows were open, because they were getting what passengers they could out through the windows. But there apparently were some infirm passengers on the bus that couldn't get out any direction. And so they pulled the front of the bus to one side, and then firefighters went in and aided these people in getting out through the main door. Well, I had done a search for news about it, and I wasn't getting anything. So a couple, 3 hours later, I refreshed the search, and there were quite a number of stories about it. Turns out the driver of this bus had a seizure. And as part of the incident then, he got the bus off to the side, but having a seizure, he didn't have full control. So it ended up getting right up against that guardrail, probably drug along the guardrail for a ways. Other than the driver, nobody was seriously injured. And, Greyhound sent it was apparently a Greyhound charter. Greyhound sent another bus to take the passengers where they were intending to go. So, and then also yesterday, you may have heard of this. An American Airlines jet, I think it was bound for Japan, took off from San Francisco. And there was some aviation buff there videoing takeoffs and landings. So he was following this plane on the way out. And the video's released on the internet. You can go watch it. You can actually see one of the tires come off this jet, off the landing gear, the main landing gear, and fall away from the jet as it's, rising into the air. Well, it turns out that beyond that particular runway, there are parking lots. The tire came down on an employee's car in the employee parking lot. I don't know if the car is going to be totaled, but it was very heavily damaged. I can't imagine it not being totaled. And then it bounced from there, took out a fence, and landed in a parking lot where they store rental cars before they get them cleaned up, ready to re-rent. Apparently it didn't damage anything there, and the interesting thing is, although it fell to the ground like that, it did not injure, nobody got injured, so.
And also in the news, big news, Facebook went down.
Yeah, it did actually. And both of us do things on Facebook, obviously, unless you're watching this on YouTube, because we do post the video to both places. Most of you are going to view this on Facebook. So we were both doing things on Facebook, and we got booted off. And apparently I didn't do the things my wife did, because I was able later to refresh my page, and I got in without any problems. My wife had to log in again. Once they got back up, so. That's the week that has been. It's been crazy. But then that's the world we live in, isn't it? So, we are covering the book of Genesis in our Friday night Bible study. And we did 3 chapters last week, chapters 12, 13, and 14. And we ran across already some of the family drama that kind of dominates the rest of this book from here to the end of it. And so from here forward, the book of Genesis is essentially a book of history, and it is telling the story of the Hebrew race from chapter 12 onward. And the Hebrew race started with the family of Abraham then Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau, and so on. And those are the stories that are told for the rest of the book of Genesis. Well, when you have family, very often you have drama. And with this family, there's a lot of it. So as we proceed forward in the book of Genesis, we're going to encounter a lot of family drama. We've already run across a little bit of it in the story of Abram in Egypt, and of Abram and Lot separating, and then of the kings of the plain versus the other kings, the 4 kings versus 5 kings, and Abram's part in rescuing the 5 kings from the victorious 4 kings. And that's kind of where we ended things last week at the end of Genesis 14. So, before we get started with this, let's bow our heads. We'll have a word of prayer and prepare for our study. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you that we are able to come together, that you have kept us safe through this week, and that now we are able to set a little time aside to spend with you and with your written word. We understand that the written word does have its flaws, but we also believe that it is capable of bringing us to a better understanding of you and your character. That's what we desire to have through our study now, and we ask that you will send the Holy Spirit that each person might receive what you intend for them, not so much what we humans would like to hear. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, switch our camera out here a little bit and call up our Bible Gateway window here and begin reading at Genesis chapter 15. Now it says sometime later, this would be sometime after the events in chapter 14, where Abram, along with some allies he had in the land, went and rescued the 5 kings from the 4 kings. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." Now, last week, when we read chapter 12, we read a promise that God made to Abram, and we discussed where that might have taken place. Was it said to him in Ur, or had he and his father already left Ur, and what we read in chapter 12 was said to him in Haran, a kind of an intermediate stop between Ur and Canaan. And we reached the conclusion that while we can't be 100% sure, the call and the promise came to Abram in Haran, calling him to leave his father's household. And we also discussed the uncertainty. If you go by the strict chart of ages out of Genesis chapter 11, then you would assume that Terah, Abram's father, was still alive when Abram left Haran for Canaan. But there are versions of the Hebrew text and the Septuagint which suggest that Terah's life was 60 years shorter than what we read in Genesis 11, in which case he may have already died. And the narrative that we read in chapter 12 suggests that he died and then Abram left. So, one of those things you can't be positive about, but that's what's going on. So, Abram received that promise at the time. He says, "I'm going to bless the entire world through you. You're going to have descendants, and they're going to be numerous. They're going to form an entire nation." And so now God sort of renews the promise, and the language we're given here, probably not exactly everything that God said to him, but the language we're given here is merely, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. And Abram's thinking of posterity. A lot of people, even in today's world, think in those terms. Got to have a son so that my name lives on. Got to have an impact on the future world. So got to have children, and they've got to go on to be great and make a name for me, and make me proud of them, and so forth. Very, very human drive and desire. And apparently Abram had that, because in verse 2, then it says, but Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, the servant of my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. Now, we don't know exactly how old Abram is here. He was 100 when his son was ultimately born. So he would have been about 86 when the previous son was born. And this is before that. So somewhere between 75 and 86 is when this story here takes place. So Abram is doubting God's promise. You've promised to reward me. You've promised to protect me. But what good is that if I don't have heirs? If I don't become the father of this great nation that you promised? Then the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have.
I think this man was deranged.
Well, he was human. And
No, I think he was deranged.
why?
Because what he did to his son, when he finally got that son, he didn't trust God to give him. Look what he did to him.
Well, how about we wait till we get to that story?
All right, but when you try to feed me fruitcake, I want a glass of milk with it.
So God now makes the promise more explicit. You will have a son of your own. And look at the stars. This was before light pollution. So where Abram was, if he went out at night and looked up, he would have seen far more stars than we see when we look up at night. Count the stars if you can. Well, no. If you're in a very dark place and you look up, you're not going to count the stars. Ain't going to happen. There's just too many. That's how many descendants you will have. Now, verse 6 is interesting, and it gets quoted. Paul quotes this text in Romans. Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. I read the wrong verse, didn't I? Verse 6 says, and Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Now, when Paul uses this, he sets up Abraham based perhaps largely on his Hebrew upbringing and his Hebrew view of history. He sets Abram up to be a paragon of faith and belief. Well, of course, faith is not entirely belief, it is also faithfulness. The Greek pistis includes that faithfulness element to it. So it's not only believing, it is believing and acting on it that is faith. So we're going to see that while Abraham believes at some point, he has trouble with it. But Paul's point is that God didn't count Abram righteous because of the good things he did or because of what a wonderful example of a human being he was. He counted him as righteous because, at least at this point, he believed in the goodness and love of God. Now, we suggest in this group that in the Old Testament the people had a fundamental misunderstanding of the character of God, a fundamental misunderstanding that perhaps a few people saw past, but most people did not, and one that was only broken when Jesus himself came to this earth and demonstrated the character of God in human flesh. Still,
people today have a fundamental misunderstanding about who God and what He is, who and what God is.
and that's based on over 1,000 years of religion misrepresenting God so that it can become more powerful.
And it has led us to a point where atheists are probably closer to God than so-called Christians.
Well,
They
what
have rejected this teaching that the church pushes, promotes.
right? They have rejected the counterfeit God promoted by organized religion. And in rejecting that counterfeit God, then they are rejecting the one who wanted to be like the Most High, who's behind all of that. And so while they may not accept a creator, they have at least rejected the imposter.
Right.
So, maybe they're halfway there. At any rate, God accepted Abram where he was at, and he counted him righteous because of the level of belief he had in God's goodness. And then the Lord told him, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. But, Abram replied, and here we see already, just 2 verses later, a little wavering in Abram's belief and faith. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? Now, so far right now, he has believed the bit about having lots of descendants. We're going to see he had trouble with that too later on here. But for now, he's believing that. But he's having a little trouble believing that he will possess the land. Now, we're going to read this next section here, and after we've read it, then we're going to go back and talk about what's going on, although some of you may be aware, because I think we had a Bible question a few months back that brought up this issue. So at verse 9, the Lord told him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." So, 3 mammals and 2 birds. So Abram presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away. Well, yeah, that's you can expect that would happen. If you have killed an animal and cut it open, you have exposed that flesh, which is what vultures eat. That's how they survive. They're going to detect it from very far away. That's what they're good at. And they're going to come down. So Abram had to chase them away. As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, "You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth." Now, verses 13 and 14, we tend to interpret those in the light of our knowledge of what actually happened in the intervening years. And I also might say about this 400 years that some interpreters, and I'm not going to say this is wrong, I'm going to say you're free to question it, as I'm going to. The language here suggests that Abram's descendants would be strangers and slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. A lot of Bible timelines, however, will mark this point as the beginning of those 400 years, rather than the time of Joseph quite a long time later. And one of the reasons for that is because they're trying to make the earth 6,000 years old. So they kind of have to compress things down. Otherwise, if you put the Hebrews in Egypt for 400 years, that pushes the beginning point at Genesis chapter 4 back more than 4,000 years between the Common Era before the Common Era divide. So, I'm not going to say it is or it isn't. I'm going to guess, based on the language here, that they actually stayed in Egypt for 400 years. And in fact, maybe more than that, because it says oppressed as slaves for 400 years. When they first got there, they weren't slaves. That happened later. Verse 15, "As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction." And I'm going to object to verse 16, at least the last part of it yet, and read that in a different version. Verse 13 out of the New International Version. "Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And in fact, if we go to a more literal version, I think we'll find that that language holds. Verse 16 out of the New American Standard Bible. Then in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, the translators of this New Living Translation have made the choice to interpret that as saying that they aren't sinful enough yet to be destroyed. But we're going to question the idea that the Lord intended their destruction. And we'll cover that more as we move on through the narrative of the Old Testament. But we're going to suggest that God did not desire their destruction. So then we wonder, well, what did he mean their iniquity was not yet full or complete? Or
Holding his protection, giving them a chance.
Yeah. They have not reached the point where I can no longer reach them.
Yeah.
They have not crossed that boundary. There's still hope for them at this point.
And that is what I believe the reason that we are still here is because there's still people that he can reach.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, doesn't it say it very specifically in the book of Peter? The Lord is not slow in fulfilling his promise, but he is long-suffering toward the human race, not willing that any should perish. And universalists will say, well, God doesn't want any to perish. God always gets what he wants, therefore nobody will perish.
It sure is getting scary out there, though.
But we take the position that God doesn't always get what he wants. So while he does want everyone to be saved, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. But again,
yeah, because they say God is in charge and God gets what he wants.
People are free to disagree with that take on it. We're just discussing the issues and stating why we believe what we believe.
What's he in charge of?
Well, if it's like he intends us to be, if we're created in his image, we were designed to be in charge of ourselves, not anybody else. So that would suggest that God is in charge of God, but not anybody else. Although we know that he does set limits on evil, and particularly on the originator of evil.
Well, God created nature, and then humans went in there and messed it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The ozone layer. Fracking.
Yeah, the seas dying and so forth.
Yeah.
Now we're getting to the part that explains verses 9 through 11. Verse 17, after the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. Now they've got a footnote there on Egypt, the river of Egypt, referring either to an eastern branch of the Nile River or to the brook of Egypt in the Sinai. See Numbers 34, verse 5.
Question.
Yes?
I recently heard somebody talking about this passage where God passed between the bodies.
We're getting to that.
Did I hear that from you or someone else?
I'll explain that in a moment.
All right.
I have
Because
given.
you, I was going to tell you, I don't remember it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about. We're about to get to it. Let me finish reading this and then we'll talk about it.
Okay.
So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I've given this land to your descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. We'll just keep that in mind, that the land was to extend all the way to the Euphrates River. The land now occupied by the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Now, the list of nations living in this area changes from place to place in the Bible, but a lot of these names appear repeatedly, particularly the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Jebusites. All those appear repeatedly when it discusses the original inhabitants of this land. Now, what are we to make of this bit about the fire pot and the flaming torch passing between the halves of the carcasses? Now, the carcasses, that obviously refers back to verses 9 through 11, when Abram got these animals and killed them, cut them in half, and laid them side by side. And then this smoking fire pot and flaming torch passed between them. Well, what is going on here? Our God, the Bible says, is a consuming fire. What would God look like if a human observed him? And when we read of the various encounters humans have had with divinity, fire is very often a big part of their descriptions. And so, if we see a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, are we not seeing what Abraham thought he was looking at when he sees God pass between the halves of these carcasses? Now, why would God do that? Why would God have Abraham, or Abram, he's not called Abraham yet, why would God have Abram kill these animals and do this? How did he know to do this even? And then by doing so, make a covenant with Abram, saying, I have given this land to your descendants, and to talk about the extent of it and to the people who still live there. Some time ago, we were listening to what's her name? I can come. Huh? Jean Sheldon. Jean Sheldon got her doctorate in studies of ancient Mesopotamia, including the ancient Babylonian culture. Now, we know that Abram was born in Ur the Chaldees, that is the city of Babylon. So he was essentially Babylonian, and he was raised in Babylonian culture. What Jean informs us about is that in Babylonian culture, this was a practice that the Babylonians engaged in. In order to cement a covenant, they would divide carcasses in half, and then the person committing themselves to the other would pass between those divided carcasses. And the meaning of it was essentially This is what you can do to me if I don't fulfill the promise I'm making. Now, the question then becomes, why would God use this obviously barbarous practice in making a covenant with Abram? Unless God was speaking to Abram in a language that Abram would understand. You have doubts about me. You don't think I can fulfill this. Well, let me make an agreement, a covenant, a contract with you in a way that you are familiar with, based on the culture that you were raised in, and commit myself to fulfilling the promise that I've already made verbally. So that, I think, shows God dealing with humans where they are, using the language and culture that they are raised in to help them understand and to draw them toward him. He's clearly drawing Abraham into a trust relationship with the Creator. And it's going to take him some time, and he's going to do some rather what we would consider strange things in order to gain Abram's trust. But he's willing to do that if he can, in fact, win the human over. Is that what you were thinking of?
Yes, it is. And for God who is totally repulsed by the barbarism, for him to have lowered himself to participate because of his love for Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
That's volumes about God.
It does. And lowering himself is kind of the meaning of Philippians 2, verses 7 and on, where it says Jesus emptied himself.
This is not the picture of a God with a 2-inch sword sticking out of his mouth who's come to destroy.
No.
This is a picture of a God who loves so much that he's willing to do whatever, no matter how nasty and repulsive, in order to win you over.
Mm-hmm. So, we have reached the end of chapter 15. I think we're ready to move on here. Looking at my clock, see how far along we are here. Now the family drama gets high drama. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him. But she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her."
Don't expect me to ever tell you that.
No. Well, I don't think you're in a culture that is as driven to produce heirs as was that culture. A woman's value was in her ability to produce heirs. So in that culture, Sarai was pretty much worthless because she wasn't producing heirs.
It's also female.
Yeah. So she has this drive to produce an heir for Abram, and the only means she can think of that is to have a surrogate mother. Now, of course, nowadays we can do in vitro fertilization and implantation and a surrogate mother can bear a child that biologically belongs to the barren woman and her husband, yeah, or the barren husband and his wife, wherever the problem lies. So that is something that with our technology today we can do. We don't think they had that technology then. So in order for Hagar, this Egyptian servant, to be a surrogate mother, she would have to be impregnated through the normal means. And that's what she's suggesting. But she's also then suggesting that through various cultural norms, that the child that is born be considered hers.
I heard a term that would be descriptive without coming right out and say it. Go in there and joyfully impale my servant.
Are you going on, or is that the end of it?
No, I don't need to say anymore.
Well, we know that polygamy wasn't a particularly big deal with these people. Sarai was Abram's half sister, so Abram's father had more than one wife. So it wouldn't have been a big deal to Sarai for her husband to have more than one wife. But that is not what she's suggesting here. She's not suggesting that Abram take Hagar as a wife. He's suggesting that Abram make her servant woman pregnant and then consider the servant woman's son his son and her son as well, and Abram's heir through Sarai. I mean,
She's planning to take the child.
yeah, and this smacks of a level of entitlement. You go through the pregnancy, you submit to my husband's amorous intentions, you go through labor and all the other problems of pregnancy.
And take care of me while you're in the process.
Yeah.
You're my maid.
Yeah.
Handmaid.
Mm-hmm. But when you're done with that, the kid ain't going to be yours, it's going to be mine. Yeah. Sarai is being toxic here. That's the only way we can interpret it. Now, it says here, this happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So at this point, he would be about 85. So whatever we read before happened before he was 85. Because he settled in Canaan when he was about 75. So if this is 10 years after, he's about 85 now. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. The more literal version will read that. And he went into Hagar and she conceived. All right. Well, anyway. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. Can I hear catfight?
Probably.
Two entitled women at each other's throats now, because once Hagar discovers that she's pregnant, she says, "Oh, well, I'm the woman that is producing an heir for Abram. You aren't. You can't boss me around anymore because I'm the big shot and you're not." And yes, that is contempt, but that doesn't absolve Sarai of whatever she's doing. Then Sarai said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me. What do you think of that? This is all your fault.
Now, I'm wondering, why did God change her name to Sarah instead of Karen?
Well, we don't know the culture of the times. Maybe Sarah meant something then what doesn't mean today. I don't know. But notice how when trouble arises, I mean, it was her idea. She put her husband up to this. But now when it goes wrong for her, what does she say?
It's your fault.
Yeah. Uh
I
huh.
mean,
And she's calling on God to endorse her innocence in this. Abram replied, "Look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. Well, there we go. Sarai being toxic again, mistreating her servant girl to the point that the girl runs away. The angel of the Lord, and we have suggested in the past when the Old Testament uses this term, it's referring to Jesus Christ, someone that they didn't have a way of referring to then, so they used this terminology. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. And some people have made an interesting parallel here. Because when Jesus was on this earth in human form, he came to a woman sitting by a well. And he dealt with her kindly, but with firm truth involved. You recall that story?
I'm sorry, I was looking up Sarah in the dictionary,
Oh.
the Bible name dictionary.
Well, we're talking about how the angel of the Lord has come across Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. And we noted that when Jesus was here on earth in human form, he came upon a woman at a well. And he dealt with her kindly, but he also dealt with her in truth and confronted her with truth. So are there similarities between that story and this one? Reading on, the angel said to her, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going?" Now here again we see God acting in dealing with someone who's misbehaving by asking questions. No doubt, in the situation that she was in fear of her mistress Sarai, and in the emotional turmoil of feeling, hey, I'm better than her because I'm having children, and then being mistreated, that she is in an emotional state. Her limbic brain is in charge, and her rational brain has been turned off by this. So now, when the angel of the Lord confronts her, he makes a move to re engage the rational brain by asking a question. That's a fairly simple question, but it does require you to put your brain in gear. Where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count.
Return to your abusive mistress
Yeah.
and let her rule over you and dominate you.
But he gives her a reason to do so. If you do what I say, I will give you these things. And specifically, I will give you more descendants than you can count. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament history, you will know that the child that she's about to bear is Ishmael, and that the Ishmaelites would be problems for the Hebrews for a very long time. So, why is God acting to rescue Hagar from the mess that's been made? Not through Hagar's fault, because she's not in a position where she can make choices. She's a servant, essentially a slave. She's not where she has any agency over her own life. This is the first time she's taken any agency by running away. But where's she going to go? Who's going to support her? Who's going to accept a child that's not theirs? The only hope for Ishmael to survive is for Hagar to return and to submit to Sarai, despite Sarai's misuse of her authority.
I'm not liking Sarai very much right now.
No, we're not. We're not necessarily being expected to. We're just reading the story and observing the family drama that's taking place here.
Now, the person's name is an indication of their character, and I looked up Sarah in the Hitchcock's Bible Dictionary,
Okay.
name dictionary, and it meant my princess.
Okay. Did you look up Sarai?
Princess.
So it got changed from princess to my princess.
Something like that, yeah.
All right. Well,
And that in itself, to me, is somebody who is feeling entitled.
yeah.
You know, I don't want to make a lump sum about all princesses, but they kind of are put up on a pedestal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of the human phenomena of celebrity. We have a tendency to elevate certain persons with skills or looks or personality or something like that, and well nigh worship them and to hold them up on a pedestal. And it can be very, very difficult for these people. And so then sometimes they don't survive it. And there are lots of examples out there. I'm thinking of Karen Carpenter or
Meghan Markle.
huh?
Meghan Markle.
Yeah, well, she hasn't died yet. I'm thinking of ones who got driven to death by what was going on with them.
Okay.
Who's the girl singer from the '60s that died when she was like 20 something? the screamer.
Janis Joplin?
Yeah. Driven by the demands of celebrity to the point that they end up, intentionally or not, taking their own lives. So yeah, this bit about princes being entitled and having in our broken human condition, having things imposed on them that they're not prepared to deal with. Yeah, that's very real. Reading on then, verse 11, and the angel also said, "You are now pregnant," news, right? "and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael," which means God hears, "for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey." There's another term for wild donkey, isn't there? "He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him." Yes, he will live in open hostility to all his relatives.
Sounds to me like he's going to be mistreated and become angry and resentful.
Well, I'm sure that's what's going to happen here. And this is not God saying, "This is what I want to have happen." We don't think God wanted Ishmael to live in hostility against all his relatives, neither for Ishmael nor for Ishmael's relatives, for the descendants of Isaac. He's just saying that he knows what's in the future. He can read human nature and human brokenness, and this is what he knows will happen as a result. Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me," or El Roi is the Hebrew for that. She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named Bir Lahai Roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. And whoever wrote this adds the note, it can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. This would have been obviously 9 months later. And so by then, Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. I was wondering if I should say something there, but I guess I won't. We'll mention that when we get to it a little bit later. So, moving on. Chapter 17. So this, it says when Abram was 90 years old. So this is about 4 years later, because he was 86 when Ishmael was born. Now he's 90. Oh, when he was 99. Whoa. We skipped a whole bunch there. 86, 99, that's 13 years. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants." At this, Abram fell face down on the ground. Then God said to him, "This is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. There's a footnote there, footnote A. Abram means exalted father. Abraham sounds like a Hebrew term that means father of many. So there's a change of name. There's not a big change in the meaning of the name, but there is this change, and there is some change in the meaning. And God already had taken Abram out and shown him all the stars and says, if you can count them, then you can count your descendants. They'll be like the stars. So now he comes, he's essentially repeating that promise, only he changes his name along with it. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants, or probably seed, footnote B, yep, which and that'll continue throughout the chapter. For you will be the father of many nations. After you, from generation to generation. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. Now, people read this everlasting and they think that that means that God's covenant with Israel to make them his special chosen people is also everlasting. But let's read this more carefully. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. Well, guess what? God doesn't have to make a promise for that to be true. God doesn't have to change anything after that, anything at all for that to be true. He created us. That makes him God. And he is always God. That never changes. And all of the human race, including all of Abram's descendants, or I guess now we could say Abraham's descendants, will have the same God. But that part is the everlasting covenant. God will always treat the human race with favor. God is not the destroyer, he's the creator. That is the everlasting covenant. That does not change. Other things change, but that does not. And I will give the entire land of Canaan, where you now live as a foreigner, to you and your descendants. It will be their possession forever, and I will be their God. Well, forever is not necessarily everlasting. Forever could be interpreted as long as life shall last. But anyway. Then God said to Abraham, your responsibility is to obey the terms of the covenant. You and all your descendants have this continual responsibility. This is the covenant that you and your descendants must keep. Each male among you must be circumcised. You must cut off the flesh of your foreskin as a sign of the covenant between me and you. From generation to generation, every male child must be circumcised on the 8th day after his birth. This applies not only to members of your family, but also to the servants born in your household and to the foreign-born servants whom you have purchased. All must be circumcised. Your bodies will bear the mark of my everlasting covenant. Any male who fails to be circumcised will be cut off from the covenant family for breaking the covenant.
Question here.
Sure.
am thinking forward to Samson, who went out and, or was it David? It was David who went out
David.
and gave Saul the bride payment of, was it 500 foreskins?
I think it was 100, but I could look it up real quick maybe.
Why the fixation on foreskins?
Well, that I'm guessing is cultural.
Is it homosexual?
Well, I think, and I can't prove this. I'm not that studied on it, but
Yeah, you get the opinion that David was and his son Solomon were men who would joyfully impale anything that walked.
well, yeah.
But of
Okay.
course, because David was a man
Yeah.
after God's heart.
The story you're thinking of comes from 1 Samuel 18, verse 25. Saul then said, "Thus shall you say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies." Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines.
So how many did he actually bring him?
David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines. Then David brought their foreskins and gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal his daughter for a wife. And then I think later, after David becomes king, see if I can find this without taking all day at it. Yeah, I'm not. I'm going to have to skip over this. I can't find it right away. He did, at some point after he became king, send to the north to get Michal back from somebody else that she had married and bring her back to himself. And he says there that he purchased her with, okay, yes, chapter 2 Samuel 3, verse 14. And I'll read verse 13. And this was as David was making a deal with Abner for Israel to become subject to David. And he said, "Good, I will make a covenant with you, but I demand one thing of you. Namely, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me." And this is essentially David speaking to Abner. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Give me my wife Michal, to whom I was betrothed, for 100 foreskins of the Philistines." That was the price that Saul named. But we read earlier that David delivered. Well, he killed 200 men. He delivered the full number of foreskins, so that would suggest that he delivered 200, not 100.
Or maybe he fumbled in removal and had to kill 200 to get the full number.
Who knows?
I mean, today, taking a life was nothing.
Well, yeah, those were very violent times, obviously. Now, I was saying before, I can't. I'm not educated enough to be able to say this with certainty, but I believe that circumcision was something that was already practiced in certain parts of the world, including in Egypt, and that the use of this may have been like God's use of the Babylonian covenant ritual that we read about back in chapter 15. That God is using this not because that's what he desires, but because that's what his people will accept and acknowledge. So you have essentially male genital mutilation taking place.
But, the male genital mutilization carried on down through the centuries. I remember years ago there was a documentary series that aired on PBS, and it was a history of the different wars that occurred in England. And I watched as many of those as I could find, as I could. I didn't get to see the first ones because I missed out that they were doing it. But in one of those wars, after the thing was over and they went to collect the spoils, the women of the area went out, dismembered the men, and then took it and stuffed it in their mouths, their own thing into their own mouth, and then buried them like that. Personally, I wouldn't want to touch the thing.
Yeah, well.
They didn't even have gloves.
Reading on, then God said to Abraham, "Regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, her name will be Sarah." And you've already looked that up and explained it. Sarai and Sarah both mean princess. The change in spelling may reflect the difference in dialect between Ur and Canaan. Now, I'm not sure about that, but "And I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants." Then Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. "How can I become a father at the age of 100?" he thought. "And how can Sarah have a baby when she is 90 years old?" So Abraham said to God, "May Ishmael live under your special blessing." Abraham's still having a little difficulty in believing God here. "You promised me a son. Now you promise me a son by Sarah, but that can't happen. She's too old. She's past menopause. Why don't you accept Ishmael? Let him live under your special blessing. But God replied, no, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac. Isaac means he laughs. And I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. As for Ishmael, I will bless him also, just as you have asked. I will make him extremely fruitful and multiply his descendants. He will become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year. When God had finished speaking, he left Abraham. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and every male in his household, including those born there and those he had bought. Then he circumcised them, cutting off their foreskins, just as God had told him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael, his son, was 13. Both Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised on that same day, along with all the other men and boys of the household, whether they were born there or bought as servants. All were circumcised with him. Hello?
I got it. I just clued in. God implemented the circumcision as a symbol to show, even though you're not physically showing it, it's representing your connection with God.
Well, yeah.
Okay, now, is there anything good that God has given us that Satan hasn't taken and twisted it and corrupted it to make it look bad?
Well, probably not.
So, what God gave, intending for good, Satan turned it into a joke and made it a sport to go out and collect foreskins.
Yeah, well.
Well, that men would be murdered in the quest for their foreskin.
Well, I know we have talked about that passage in the past, and we've noted that Saul's intent was for David to get killed by the Philistines while he was trying to get all that, but David succeeded anyway. And we have talked about the reason for the particular token that Saul wanted, because if he made it foreskins, then he knew that no Hebrews had foreskins for David to produce. So he was certain that he would have to go to Philistines in order to get them.
Yeah, don't kill his men, kill the others.
Right.
The enemy.
Yeah. And of course, we're going to see this covenant symbol misused not that far into the future in this story in the book of Genesis of this chosen but still messed up family. And I might make this note as we kind of close off here.
God chooses toxic families.
Yeah.
And saves them.
God uses broken people. Yes. For the most part, the historical accounts in the Bible do not make moralistic judgments. They simply report what happened. Now, there are places, a few places in the book of Kings and more places in the books of Chronicles, which make those moralistic judgments from time to time. But for the most part, we're simply told what happened, and it's left up to us to determine, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, probably 99% of the time, if a human did it, it was a bad thing. But
Well, use your brain and think about it. And if you need a little help, refer to the quote that I have posted in this group that where I'm quoting Dr. Greg Boyd.
no. If you come across a teaching that makes God out to be anything less than love, that teaching is wrong and it needs to be restudied. So, we have already come across a number of instances where Abraham now has failed to demonstrate full belief in God. And we will run across more before we get done with this story.
And that was Abraham who failed to love, not God.
Right. So, looks like our time is up, and so we will plan to leave you and make plans to meet you again next week. We'll try to have this uploaded about the same time on the Facebook group. When it gets up on YouTube is a little bit less certain, but it will eventually, I expect, take place. So we will say to you, what?
I need you back here as soon as you can get free.
Okay, I'll be there.
Bye.
So until then, we do say goodbye and God bless.